Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the Heyman Center series in New Books in the Arts and Sciences. We're here to celebrate the publication of a major new book by our esteemed colleague, Professor Bernard Harcourt. This is the book, Critique and Praxis. My name is Lydia Liu. I teach in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and I direct the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to mention quickly that we will try to keep the panel discussion within the time limit, approximately 1 hour or maybe just a little above that, so we can leave some time for interaction with the audience. And on the audience side, you will find a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page where you will be able to post a question. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and also to acknowledge some co-sponsors this event. The Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, Maison Française, Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, an Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And there are always individuals who work behind the scenes. Eileen Giluli, Kelly McKinney, and Kay Zhang. It's their hard work that brings us together for this event. And I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the speakers, as we don't have a lot of time. And these are all very accomplished scholars, and they have published so much. I'm not going to recite every single one. Our author, Bernard Harcourt, is the Isidore Seville Zuckbacher Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Columbia. And he's also the founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. And he's a prolific scholar and an activist, has worked to represent pro bono inmates sentenced to death and life imprisonment without parole. Last year, he was awarded the New York City Bar Association Norman Redlich Capital Defense Distinguished Service Award for his work on behalf of individuals on death row. Among his prolific publications and numerous accomplishments, this new book is his magnum opus, one that will interest and challenge many of us scholars as well as activists who fight for justice and equality. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today. Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak is a university professor and a founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Her most recent publications include the 2016 40th anniversary edition of Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology. Readings in 2014, and an Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization, 2012. Due to a schedule conflict, Professor Spivak cannot join us today, but has kindly recorded her response, which we will play shortly. Professor Karuna Mantana is Professor of Political Science at Columbia. You see her on the left side. She is the author of Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine, and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism. She's currently working on a book tentatively titled Gandhi's Realism, Means and Ends in Politics. Meek Taussig is the class of 1933 professor of anthropology at Columbia. Thanks for waving. He's the author of Palma Africana, The Corn Wolf, and What Color is the Sacred? And then finally, Martin Saar is professor of social philosophy at the Goethe-Universität Frankfurt am Main. His published works include Die Immanenz der Macht and Genealogie aus Kritik among his other works. Now here is the order of presentation. We will begin with Professor Spivak's recorded response first. And this will be followed by a short presentation by the author, Bernard Harcourt. And then we will have Professor Karina Mantana, Professor Miek Taussig, and Professor Martin Saar, each speak for 8 minutes in that order. After that, I'm going to ask Bernard to give the final response, and then we'll open up for discussion. So now we're going to play Professor Spivak's recorded response.
My profound respect for my friend Bernard Harcourt was initially based on his work against the death penalty. What is most impressive about this work is not only the decades-long obsessive devotion to detail, but also the absolute absence of self-promotion, the presentation of all the awards. It's fantastic in that. In this age of extravagant self-staging, of top-down philanthropy, Harcourt asks not only what is it to help, but also who am I to help? Very important, ignored question. In this age of mistaking fundraising for activism all around us, Harcourt's work shines like a star. I'm so sorry I couldn't be at the actual book launch, but I really wanted to say this. When he became my colleague, I began to resonate with him. What Wittgenstein calls mitschwingen, resonate with him. For he, in addition to serious activism, was also committed to theorizing as an activity, as a practice, rather than something produced by mostly great men or honorary men that you learn and apply. This became clearer and clearer in the fantastic work of the Critique 1313 seminar series that he has been doing for the last few years, rethinking the theoretical as he brings the world into Columbia. I have participated, I'm fortunate enough to have participated in it as far as possible, and I hope to do so again. Now, the many levels of questioning, sedimenting and sedimented in all his work has been laid out in this extraordinarily readable text. It's fantastic to read. It's a page-turner, Critique and Praxis. In our time, the entire situation of activism, class differentiated, race differentiated, gender differentiated, but also language differentiated, if you want to reach the broad-based global subaltern, the person separated from the rights of citizenship, has to be understood in a completely new way so that digitization does not betray us. In order to use the digital effectively, the task for the individual is to prepare herself or himself epistemically and critically ethically, so that the collective becomes effective, not just simply as a digitized crowd standing in for democracy. Harcourt's book confronts this. In my endorsement, I write, he utilizes illusion and value, makes theory and practice collide. This somewhat complicated sentence becomes crystal clear in the reading of the book. Now I want to emphasize that if we have learned a lesson from the first round of global movements for social justice, and Harcourt summarizes them well, mine would necessarily be contextually different. It is that we must focus as much on the individual as on the collective. This is not a binary, deeply politicized opposition. We must focus as much on the individual as on the collective. Tremendously difficult, but necessary. Necessary and impossible, I would say, to cite my formula. Focus as much on the individual as on the collective, a double mind. The persistent task of teaching the humanities beyond the disciplines, and no one listens to this anymore. It's too hard. The persistent task of teaching the humanities beyond the disciplines. For the trivialized disciplinarization of the humanities today is a technologization that turns each class into a toolkit. Harcourt's work makes me want to say again what I said to the World Economic Forum when I was on their committee on value. You cannot have a moral matrix from knowledge management techniques. You cannot have a moral matrix. You have to devote slow time to the nurturing of the soul. Then the person becomes capable of using the digital for social justice rather than for all of the cyber hacking and so on, and all of the crimes. I mean, we now know what kinds of crimes are at election time. So this is what I said to the World Economic Forum, that you have to take that slow time before you can actually develop the ethical judgment with which to use the digital well. Reading, writing of this genre, and examples are very few, should become an obligation. As the disciplines become more and more siloized, such work should be used to undo those boundaries in a responsible way, not so-called superficial interdisciplinarity. I have in my teaching discovered again and again how easy it is to do this badly. So as the disciplines become more and more siloized, such work should be used to undo those boundaries in a responsible way. In Harcourt's work, law and the humanities are embraced in a Moebius strip. Let us call for a real readership, refusing to accept a law confused with order and humanities shackled to digitized knowledge management. Here, Bernard Harcourt is our comrade. And once again, I urge you to read this book carefully, sometimes irritated, but always rewarded. A fantastic book. Thank you.
Thank you. Although Professor Spivak isn't here, but I still want to thank her for starting a conversation at this level of engagement. And so we now turn to Bernard himself, the author.
Thank you, Lydia. And yes, thank you, Gayatri Spivak. Thank you also, Martin Zar, Michael Tausig, and Karuna Mantena for being here and for engaging this book, which is brand new, and for everyone here who is participating. Thank you. So in her very generous comments, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak puts her finger on a key tension that animates this book. And it's, on the one hand, right, there's this ambition about the collectivity. There's a horizon of solidarity and justice and equality within the collectivity. But the pathway goes through the self. It goes through the individual. And the book was originally animated, and you can sense this tension because the book was originally animated by the question, what is to be done? What is to be done in these times of crisis, of global climate crisis, of global neoliberalism, of the rise of proto-fascism, and now, of course, the pandemic. And originally, it came from this ambition to urge us to stay true to the action imperative in these times of crisis. But it gradually transformed the question, what is to be done, into the question, what more am I to do? How am I to understand my own praxis, my own interventions, my own work, and how to change that praxis, how to act. And so I'm deeply grateful to Gayatri Spivak that introduction and for putting her finger on that key tension in the book. Of course, Gayatri Spivak is one of our most generous and inspiring colleagues here at Columbia University, and has been a terrific interlocutor in the 1313 series. And her own work constitutes, of course, a whole section of this book. Now, let me frame the book quickly for our discussion here, because I'm here really to learn from you more than to speak. The book attempts to push us as critical thinkers out of our zone of comfort, to push us out of contemplation and crisis diagnosis towards a more uncomfortable, risky, often less elegant space, but an urgent domain of praxis and action. Less elegant because it's often there that we sound less theoretical. It's often there that we lose our bearings and have to kind of put ourselves at risk. In the process of doing this, I intend to kind of recalibrate the conception and genealogy of critical philosophy, so as to show that it really began not so much with the more ambiguous bifurcated notion of critique in the 18th century, but in the challenge to change the world and not just interpret it from the 19th century. The book has three parts: a theoretical reconstruction, an analysis of utopias or horizons, and the focus on praxis, or what I call illusions, values, and action. And all of the theoretical work in the book is geared towards that ambition of praxis and action. For our panel today, I think we're going to spend more time perhaps on the first part, which is the theoretical part. And so I'll just say a few words about that. In that part, I try to resolve the fundamental tension, or the fundamental clash between two important strands of critical philosophy, namely the Frankfurt School and post-structuralism. Or to be more specific, the clash between the early Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and Adorno on the one hand, and the post-structuralism of Deleuze and Foucault on the other. Why that clash, you may ask? I think the answer is because it laid the groundwork for the debates in contemporary critical theory today. The first strand, the early Frankfurt School, was generally wedded to the project of changing the world, at least in its early programmatic stage when Horkheimer was giving the school direction. But it was, in my view, overly determined, over-determined by an adherence to Marxian philosophies of history and political economy and labor. The second strand is the one that most directly confronted the Marxian roots and offered a different way forward, drawing far more on Nietzsche's epistemology. That was the Deleuze of the early 1960s and Foucault as well, and of course the Foucault of the early 1970s. That clash, I believe, is the most productive, and it's the soil that would nourish, by way of opposition and rejection, the contemporary critical theories of post-colonialism, of subaltern studies, Gayatri Spivak's work, of queer theory, of trans theory, and of all the kind of contemporary critical theory that must guide us today. So the book is born out of a frustration with the Marxian foundationalism of the early Frankfurt School, and also with a frustration with the subsequent refoundations in Hegel and Kant of later generations of the school, but also out of a frustration with the self-imposed limitations or constructive limitations of Foucault and of deconstruction and of much of discourse analysis. In the sense, I was particularly frustrated with Foucault's response in an interview with the psychiatrist David Cooper and others in 1977, when he was asked whether after criticism there could be a stage at which we might propose something. And you'll recall his answer, of course. He carefully demurred and he said, "My position is that it's not up to us to propose. As soon as one proposes a vocabulary and ideology which can only have effects of domination." Well, I agree, but I reject that answer because critique in itself is a proposition. The object of critique, the form of critique, the very work that we do before supposedly proposing something is not neutral. It is itself and has effects of domination. And so one just has to deal with that fact. There's no escaping it, as Foucault wished. And how I resolve the problem, or at least try to resolve the problem, is by turning the question away from the more dominating ones of what is to be done, what should others do, to the question, turning it on oneself in a much more self-reflexive way. What more am I to do with my own praxis, with my years of struggle against these phenomena? So I try to thread a needle between these different philosophical approaches, developing what I call a critical theory of illusions that is intended to push us toward action in the moment, in the situation, given our best evaluation, stripped of as many illusions as we can identify for the moment, but knowing, of course, that we are in the process of building new ones. The work is in conversation with the work of the generous scholars who are here today. It's in conversation with Martin Zarr, whose work on social philosophy is central to the book, and who represents the future, the horizon of the Frankfurt School, along with others, Frieder Vogelmann, but who really is kind of pushing the Frankfurt School in new directions. It's in conversation with Karuna Mantena's extraordinary work on Gandhi and on nonviolence, which is central to, because the issues of violence are central to this book. I'm thrilled that Karuna could be here. We actually started graduate school together. So even though I'm a generation older, I feel like we've been together for a long time. And it's in conversation with all of McTausig's work on political disobedience and Occupy, and so many of the other theoretical and practical pursuits, including Rehova and elsewhere, and whose work is again central to the discussion of forms of praxis in this work, as well as with Lydia Liu. Special thank you for moderating, Lydia, but who's been an extraordinary interlocutor and integral part of the 1313 series. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to your readings. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now turn to Professor Manteena.
Terrific, thank you. Yes, of course, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here to celebrate Bernard's new book, Critique and Praxis. And as Bernard just mentioned, I've known Bernard since graduate school, but it is a special pleasure to now be a part of this conversation as a new colleague and co-conspirator here at Columbia. So it's lovely. Critique and Praxis is an extraordinary book. For one, it is ambitious in scope. The range of authors, projects, and arguments that Bernard engages respectfully and critically are truly incredible. They reflect some of the conversations we've had in the 13 series, and which makes that series so extraordinarily vibrant. And I learned something on every page. He just covers a number of people and gets you to reflect. And I think it provides a landscape of the field of critical theory. And I would say a bird's eye view, but actually I think what makes it really more compelling is that it's not done at a distance, but it's the view of a co-participant in this adventure and part of an ongoing critical dialogue within critical theory of what critical theory can be and do. So I think it is a very different kind of book, and one that I think, as Gayatri Spivak said, it's just not, it's a rare kind of combination. To me, it's not just an intellectual history or purely philosophic analysis in a good way. It is something much more personal, as we've already sort of heard. And I think one of the things that I found very disarming and compelling that kept me in the conversation was precisely this way in which it was Bernard's voice speaking. It was a personal address. It was Bernard's voice speaking to you. It's a self-interrogation. It has a way of thinking about reflexively that is never indulgent, but sincere and dialogic. And I felt it was a kind of model of bringing a conversation. So I really admire it. It's a very brave form of writing as well. The main thrust of the book, the provocation, the exhortation, as we've heard, is really Bernard's concern that critical theory has lost its connection to praxis, lost the Marxist and Marx's own exhortation to not just philosophize or critique the world, but to change it. And as he just looked at, one of the great frames of the book is to look at two prominent traditions of critical theory, the Frankfurt school and their model of immanent critique, alongside Foucault and Deleuze, a model of genealogical critique, and trying to understand in a way why these different traditions, maybe partially because of the contrast and competition between them, have in different ways come to privilege theory over practice. And some of the reasons he gives for this, I think, are interesting to think through. One, of course, that there is a way in which this epistemological battle between these various traditions about normativity, about critique, have had this unintended effect, perhaps, of receding the conversation in critical theory into theory, constantly receding it back to theory and receding it away from praxis. And some sense that there's a primary need to solve or attend to these meta-normative or foundational questions, again, before coming back to practice. So that's one reason why we never seem to come back to the question of practice. Another, I think, another in a way might be part of the success of contemporary critical theory. One of the great contributions of both traditions, and especially maybe the more recent post-structural, post-colonial, critical race theory, queer studies, is really drawing attention to the mental constructs and categories that are involved in situations of domination. This, in a way, is one of the great triumphs of the last generation of theory, but it may also be a hurdle because, again, it's a way in which theory gets receded into theory. And I think, again, in two ways. One is, in a way, this is practical work, but there's a problem, I think, and Bernard I think, rightly points out, it is political and practical to do this sort of exposition or exposing of dominating knowledge. On the other hand, it makes a kind of conflation between theory and praxis, again, a kind of recession. And I think, as Bernard mentioned, the other is a kind of worry of that anxiety about imposing new forms of domination, new constructs, new conditions of power and knowledge. And so there is also, alongside it, as a critical tradition, that there is a move away from thinking about practical utopias because they're seen as dogmas of domination or dogmas of revolution. So I think these are really important and, again, brave and provocative and challenging questions for people who do critical theory to think through how we can both take on the achievements, but also think more critically about where to go from there forward. Again, I think one of the great, the personal address, which Bernard and Guy Spivak have mentioned, and I'll just mention what I think it is a very profound shift in the question to ask about praxis. So I'm going to say just a couple of things about the final connection to praxis. One, I think Bernard mentioned, it's such I think, a very provocative way to rethink this question, converting the question of what is to be done to what more am I to do? Another framework, what more shall I do? What is my praxis doing? I'll add here, Professor Spivak gave also a different take on it, which was, who am I to help, or who am I who is doing the action, which is another layer, I think. These, I think, are extraordinarily interesting. I think they bring up exactly what was noted, a kind of relationship between individuality or individual action and collective action. And it asks the question about starting with posing a question to myself. To me, this is very close to the tradition of nonviolence. It's, in fact, the way Tolstoy answered the question, what is to be done, is always a question about how to be accountable to myself. So it's always also going to be a point of acting has to have some relationship, and the person you're accountable to first and foremost is yourself in some way, being true to who you are, to what personality means, what freedom means, what a way of living outside of mental slavery in some senses is living according to your own sense. So I think this is, to me, there's a lot to build on there and think through how that language it can be revived and tethered to a new way of thinking about praxis. The one, I'm going to end with just one little quibble, because I can't end without one little quibble, but one is just, I do think, again, I'm really with and interested in continuing this conversation with Bernard on what it means to have a what he calls a unidirectional relationship between theory and practice. So how do you have a bidirectional, or how do you actually think through the relationship between theory and practice? So one, as he says, is one problem is theory is receding from practice. The other is we might think that theory is applied practice. So the other side of it is a kind of unidirectional where theory goes to practice. And here I think he rightfully, actually also gives us examples of what the limitations are of just thinking of theory, of coming up with an idea that theory needs to be applied in practice. So it's already prefigured, and that does have an impositional character, a dogmatic character. Another is that we might think we're thinking about practice, but we end up maybe as an occupational hazard of just theorizing practice. So we look at practice and then we theorize it, but it's another way we're not really integrating the questions of theory of practice. And another, maybe a kind of third might be, we might actually elegize practice and kind of think about the autonomy of practice. So again, that still we see practices as just emergent. The most interesting practices we might think is those who break through frameworks or are insurgent. But on the other hand, we might celebrate and not actually reconnect reconnect that practice to theory. So I am with Bernard. I think all of these things are exactly the right questions to ask. I think my little quibble is I worry that some of the final answers he gives on praxis might fall into a disconnection between theory and practice. And I'll only give one example, which is one that he repeats, and it's very powerful, where he repeats quite often that when we think of critical practice, we should really be suspicious of portability. That each attempt, a practice, a political practice, is always an intervention, a counter politics. These are extremely situated. In fact, I was trying to find the exact formulation, but he says each of them should come with a GPS timestamp. They're so individual, and that's important. But I do think that but I want to ask, is that true? Because on the other hand, we hear a lot in the praxis section about a kind of set of practices that travel, practices of occupation, language of occupation, practices of assembly, practices of counter resistance. All of these have always traveled and if we go back to the 20th century, of course, models of Marxist revolution, models of nonviolence. So I think there is, of course, a worry that imposed dogma would stop innovation. But on the other hand, if you want to change the world, then innovation has to be learned and repeated and tested in different places. So I actually think portability is not necessarily the same as universalizability in the hard sense or dogmatic application. So I actually think a term like portability doesn't have to mean, in fact, it means something different. So I think if you keep to a very situated individualism, then you are declaring an autonomy to an individual practice that can't be repeated or learned from. And I think actually what you can think about is learning and experiencing across time. And again, of course, for me, I've been thinking, of course, a lot about the history of nonviolence. And to me, I think that's a perfect example. I think some of the long history of Marxist revolution is too, where someone like Gandhi innovated theory from practice. He didn't have a theory of satyagraha. He didn't even have the term satyagraha before he started civil disobedience. He invented the term to match the practice. That we know his thinking came with practice. MLK is very similar, but also in the translation and adoption of nonviolence from one global context to another was a process of learning, of translating, of connecting, of adding, and it wasn't dogmatic application. And in fact, maybe even less, maybe some of the Marxist translations of revolution were dogmatic. There were difficult questions of trying to repeat a script. Nonviolence didn't have that same dogmatism, and it's certainly true that there were real connections. African Americans who went to India, Indians who came to America that led workshops, read common texts, distilled philosophy and shared it to activists. That process is knowledge production and sharing. It's producing theory and sharing theory. So my only thing would say, at some level, practices have to be portable or thought through and experimented and adapted for it to generate theory. So to have the directionality come back to theory. And I think that's another, so I would say there's another book to be rewritten where you start with praxis and then get to theory. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you, Karuna, for asking that very important question, not only to Bernard, but to all of us, the portability of practice, and where do we even turn to look for theory. Now, next, Professor Mick Taussig. Do I see you? Yes, please go ahead, Mick.
Turn on your mic.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. I've written up a little comment here. I've called it On Showing One's Hand. My friend Bernard Harcourt, who since many years as a lawyer has fought against capital punishment and has injected badly needed energy into the intellectual life of Colombia with his monthly seminars, tells us off the bat in this new book that we should write different. We should write different, be reflexive, for instance, and write in the first person. It is a marvelous book, lucid and passionate, in which he quotes Edward Said in Orientalism so as to illustrate Michel Foucault's notion that ideas are embedded in power. The quote reads, not embedded in power, but embedded in a style of thought, embedded in a style of thought. Such embedding is not to be thought of as superstructure to underlying truth. To the contrary, in my reading of Bernard, style makes truth, and truth is aesthetic, no less than emotional, and can be awfully corporeal. The question then surges as to how one disembeds a style of thought. Try doing this to Trump or Trumpism, then ask yourself about your own embeddednesses. Disembedding seems more a work of art than our praxis admits. It puts us on the spot as to what degree is style something of which we are consciously aware in our own work. In our writing, for example, are we not bound unconsciously to a praxis that I call agribusiness writing, which uses magic to deny magic and allows little scope for the unorthodox, like fictocriticism? Nietzsche, who occupies an incandescent role in Bernard's new book, would probably say we are not sufficiently aware of power as style, while he himself hammered out a lapidary style more aphoristic than narrational, with songs as well. He was, after all, like most shamans, madly keen on music, not to mention opera. And as regards the body, wasn't his a view that philosophy was based on an understanding of the body, or rather a misunderstanding? 2, the current era seems like the 60s redux, when all that is solid melts into air. I remember a scene. It is 1968 in the London School of Economics. It is like a dream. My laconic friend, Jim Clark, tall, lanky, and acne-scarred, is surrounded by a swarm of Trotskyists. Anyway, Jim, what's your line? They demanded, both threatening and perturbed. Putting down his beer, he paused, then announced in a fierce north of England brogue, I'm a situationist Bolshevik. Well, that did it. With that, he disembodied, or should I say disembedded, their style with a wildly contradictory mix of Bolshevism and a Marxist anarchist surrealism from Strasbourg. Not only was it internally contradictory, but it was, in Bernard's terms, defetishizing to the core, due to that mix, and especially due to that surreality. Defetishizing is not unmasking so much as remasking with what Breton called wild love. 3. In the library close by, I tried to read a strangely proportioned journal, hot off the press. It was a lot wider than it was tall, and Pache Bernard, it was called Theoretical Praxis. Edited by Ben Brewster, it contained a translation of Louis Althusser's essay on the ideological state apparatus. In its language, let us definitely say in its style, it threw down the gauntlet to British Marxism, to what Perry Anderson had emphasized as the shortcomings of British style, seeped in empiricism and plain language. We students were rhapsodic at the challenge. We imagined this contorted style from across the channel presented to our profs. It came across not only as critique, but praxis as well, starting with the oddball physical dimensions of the journal. Not long after, Edward Thompson wrote a spirited critique of Althusserian thought entitled The Peculiarities of the English, complete with eccentric drawings of various apparatuses. It was decidedly of another style, or should I say, another praxis, beginning with its clarity, its humor, and its impressive length. Later in the 80s, I attended the talks on causation in history given by British Marxist luminaries at the opening of the New School's new undergraduate division. Then came Thompson, who was, as I was told later, working full-time with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Drawing himself tall, he began, and I paraphrase from memory, I walked by the New York Public Library on my way here today, and my heart leapt at the thought of the treasure therein. But I have stopped doing history so that there will be history for others to write. This was refreshing. This was style. It smacked of real life. It was poetic. It was radical. It made me realize how impossible it is to separate theory from praxis. Theory is praxis, and praxis is theory, and style is both. We might recall that Thompson was deeply interested in the 18th century radical possibilities of mysticism and aesthetics, as we find in his book on the engraver and poet, William Blake. 4. Bernard cites the young Marx's passionately revolutionary letters to Arnold Rouge. They are inspiring, they are poetry, they are letters, a form of one-to-one personal communication, a different style. Walter Benjamin also cites from one of these letters to use as an epigraph in his famous Paris Arcades project. The quote reads, "The reform of consciousness consists solely in the awakening of the world from the dream it has about itself." End of quote. To the degree that awakening is similar to Bernard's de-fetishization, let me mention a few techniques used by Benjamin, especially that of montage, taken over from photography and film. Another would be the use of quotation as the preponderant feature of the text. They are like highway robbers, Benjamin said of quotations. They rob readers of their opinions. And still another technique would be the surrealist techniques used in his One-Way Street and the Denk Builder, or thought images. Then there is Benjamin's accent on writing in the state of emergency, not as the exception to the rule, but now the rule itself, encouraging a view of Marxism as dependent on theology, the dwarf hidden under the chessboard. There is a mythology in our language. We work with it and against it, just as it works with us and against us, which is what Saidiya Hartman invokes in not explaining, but responding to the silence of the violence of slavery with what she calls critical fabulation. As for surrealism, in 1938 in Paris, this became hooked to Marxism as well as to Freud, Nietzsche, and ethnography through the short-lived anti-fascist Collège de Sociologie, With its focus on what it calls sacred sociology, it never even made it to the roster of critical theory. That is a pity, as the world today re-enchants and becomes hideously surreal. In conclusion, I want to return to the focus on writing at the beginning of Bernard's book. He shows his hand, he says, "It is a gesture of invitation. We should show ours." That is why I want to emphasize the power of stories and anecdotes, which as art do the defetishizing work he would have us do. Thank you. Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you so much for introducing yet another dimension to this conversation. And you are demonstrating that we cannot keep poetry out of the conversation. Wonderful, you call it style. So now we turn to Professor Martin Zhao.
Hello, New York. This is Frankfurt at 6 p.m. So this might explain why it's a little bit dark in the background of my screen. Since I'm last, I can cut some of the introductory and laudatory remarks, and I'll cut straight to the bone of my little commentary. And this is something Bernard and I share, and he has mentioned it already. The both of us are trying hard to shoulder the legacy of critical theory, not only in the general, but also in the narrow sense. It's also an attempt to shoulder the legacy of critical theory in the Frankfurt School sense. And this is something we do jointly, but also differently. So I will focus on a difference in reading the legacy and the history of the Frankfurt School critical theory proposal. So while it is definitely true that this theoretical tradition can be read and can be criticized as to whether it gave enough room to practice, there are definitely other essential traits that make it an important ally for Bernard, who I call Harcourt in this paper, project. It is one in particular of which I'm unsure if I find or recognize it in his appropriation, given his aversion to objectivist, foundationalist, or theoreticist strands in this tradition. And this might be, it must not be, but it might be a lacuna, even a challenge to his own project. What I mean is critical theory in the Frankfurt sense, essential connection to social science in a specific sense, or to social theory, or to what we in German call Gesellschaftstheorie. That means it's being a form of philosophy cum social science, as it were. Social science here for the first and second generation was important, not because it would lay any foundations, but because it would let us read society, the social, our world, in a certain way. And this is an overlap with some of the things Nick just said. This, to my light, does not imply scientism, does not imply positivism, but a commitment to the embeddedness of theory within a context that has to be disclosed and analyzed before it can be assessed or transformed. Let me elaborate this point. When Horkheimer, in his famous 1931 inaugural lecture on the present situation of social philosophy and the tasks of an institute for social research, calls for the collaboration of philosophers with economists, sociologists, and social psychologists, this was less a search for secure scientific knowledge, but the call for another form of reflexive theorizing that turns on its own social conditions that tend to disappear in classically understood philosophical reflection. Adorno's inaugural lecture from 1930, The Actuality of Philosophy, made a similar gesture, integrating this need for social reflection into the philosophical ethos of a post-idealist critical philosophy, definitely a model for Harcourt. For Adorno, such a philosophy is committed to interpretation, Deutung, not research, Forschung. This does not merely take up or replicate social reality, but is actually constructing or creating something or inventing it, namely a distinctive, as he calls it, figure or image of social reality. There is only one passage where an example is given for this possibility to, and I cite Adorno, and it's a complex, dense sentence, to group the elements of a social analysis in such a manner that the way they came together made a figure which certainly does not lie before us organically, but which must first be posited or produced. And his main example, of course, is the core notion of any Marxist account of capitalist society, namely the commodity structure or commodity form. Therefore, for Adorno to understand contemporary capitalist society in such a way is the outcome of a specific interpretation of a Deutung, not a fact to be observed or described directly. And it is definitely not something that the political agents or subjects would have to be aware of. It's the outcome of a theoretical construction that is in itself figural or imaginal. And this formal construction of a totality out of many elements is an act of making us see a coherent whole, a Zusammenhang, while empirical reality until now just gave the impression of an incoherent ensemble of many different plural non-cohering phenomena before they were theorized, but they are now seen through the lens of a certain conception or construction of the world. And this is at the same time a philosophical, inventive gesture, as it is tied to a certain social theoretical and social empirical description of the entities of our social environment. Harcourt, of course, knows both, and he cites both of these texts. But while his focus on escaping foundationalism and overcoming scientism leads him to already suspect the early critical theorists of betraying the real task of social transformation for the sake of pure theory, I see another understanding of this project that transforms the very shape or gestalt of theory in such a way that its interconnection with social practices become visible, even if, of course, this is not in itself already a radical intervention into them. It is an act of description and of constructing constellations or figures in the manifold material of the social world. In other words, it's a theoretical operation that prepares and enables intervention, but it has to be grounded in, or it has to stick to the very social world it is about. And this non-speculative worldliness of social thought calls for the very social inquiries the non-positivist social sciences from Weber to Simmel to qualitative sociology of the 1940s and 50s provide. And I think, and Adorno thought, critical philosophy cannot do without them. So in this picture, it is not a chasm or a cleavage between theory versus practice or epistemology versus engagement, but it's a mediated sequence of conceptual thought, social theory, social reality, with critical theory being the form of thinking that draws them closely together without dissolving their boundaries completely. Therefore, again, I hold that constructing a critical reflection on political practice without the mediation of or through the social sciences might not be loyal to the tradition we are talking about. But who cares, you might say, all the worse for this tradition. But looking at two core elements of Harcourt's own proposal might illustrate this point as a real challenge. This is first the question of illusions and the question of values. And let me just illustrate what I mean when I say this might be things or topics that cannot be theorized on a more philosophical plane, but they call for the real integration of social science, let's say, in the most ambitious meanings of the term. The former, the question of illusion, for me seems hard to theorize from a purely conceptual philosophical point of view without an inclusion of perspectives from social or cognitive psychology, maybe even psychoanalysis. We might not even see the problem of persistent illusions or ideologies, of delusions, of self-deceptions, of cognitive dissonance, wishful thinking, without referring to the workings of the mind and the psyche, the motivational economies of affect and desire. And remember that for early critical theory, this meant including Freudianism as a necessary component of Marxist sociology. Any social theory of illusion that tries to get off the ground will need to describe, analyze, and map these phenomena, and philosophy or theory might just not be enough for this job. As to values, the core chapter in the book is brief, and the appeal to emancipatory and progressive values is rather apodictic. I, for my part, cannot think about this outside the comparative, empirical, and historical frame. This means to me that collaboration with what we might call an anthropology of ethics or a sociology of morality is indispensable. For me, the philosophical question of values is not the question of a person who has them and brings them to theory or to practice, but of the very and many systems of evaluation that are established, maintained, and transformed by specific actors and specific institutions. the critical philosophical task is to suspend the immediate appeal to values and treat them themselves as social entities. And we might be skeptical about the 1930s talk of bourgeois versus proletarian values, but to situate values socially, culturally, historically is the first step to break their seeming naturalness. Again, for me, the lesson from critical theory is not to overcome excessive theorization or what Bernard calls epistemology, but to allow for minor empirical material descriptions and analyses. So in conclusion, let me raise a worry and a hope. My hope is that Harcourt is forced by the pattern of his thinking to place himself in the subjectivist or voluntarist corner of the spectrum, trying to leave behind an excessive focus on theory, on reflection, and too much academic forums. At times, this makes him sound like the political existentialist who thinks that ultimately critique and engagement rest on choice and taking sides. My point is that critical theory in its historical form, and it was an open, undogmatic form of Marxism, was an attack on and not a defense of this position. My hope is, my real hope, and I'm serious, is that Bernard knows all this and has thought this through already, that there might be an existentialist or voluntarist tone or ring to his proposal, but that the proposal itself remains committed to the relentless and non-illusory understanding of our social reality and our place in it with all the theoretical and empirical tools available. What he is passionately highlighting is, at least in my hopeful reading, is that only the last spark that turns this critical knowledge into action will be non-theoretical and irreducible to any idea, this spark being the passion for justice and the hope for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin Sauer, speaking to us from Frankfurt, which means a lot since the discussion is here focused on critical theory. We have, Bernard, how are we going to do it? I'm going to limit your response to 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, yes. I mean, this is the beginning of many longer conversations, but I will try in 5 minutes to address some of the main and brilliant interventions that were just made, okay? So, and what I'd like to do is I think I'm gonna start with Martin, then Karuna, then Mick, because actually, so I didn't know what you would think, but I think this is gonna work better in terms of the responses. First, quickly, and I'll be as quick as possible. So the role of social science in this analysis is central. The act of unmasking illusions generally involves empirical work. Certainly the illusions that I have spent the past decades struggling against, those having to do with notions of orderliness, orderliness in the context of order maintenance in society, or of the free market, or the notion of the free market, are integrally, and the only way to understand that these are illusions is actually to use our best empirical work. I wouldn't call it social science, and I wouldn't use the word science. And here, one of the things that frustrated me most, maybe, with Horkheimer's 37 essay was modeling everything on the natural sciences, essentially. I mean, using that as a segue into the analysis. And I would not, because I would say that in the social realm, it's social research, which is the Institute for Social Research. It's social research rather than science. And why? In part because the social sciences are actually far too young at this stage still. And it's fascinating to look at the transformations, for instance. The fact that we've been doing multiple regression analysis on multivariable analysis for decades, and that it's all being put into question, thrown out because of now the need to do experiments, or whatever it is. I mean, these transformations that literally rip the rug under social scientists who've been doing this work and believing so strongly in their work for so many decades and claiming so much on its basis, just reveals that you have to be extraordinarily careful in this domain. And it doesn't mean, of course, that you don't do the best you can at a particular point in time. It just means that first you don't talk about it as a form of science. You talk about it as a form of kind of empirical testing. I mean, and of course this ties to the core epistemological claim in this text, having to do with a rejection really of the notion of truth and an acceptance simply of a notion of, you know, falsifiable theories about what we have, but needing to act, meaning that we have to adjudicate this at a particular point in time, so that we can, in fact, rid ourselves of particular illusions. But I think in the end, Martin, I would be willing to accept that the last spark is certainly an existential passion for justice in these situations. So maybe we're not that far apart. We would need to spend more time analyzing, doing both a genealogy and an updated assessment of social sciences. But I think it's impossible not to be engaged in social research in order to address these belief systems that we have and that structure us. Now, that brings us then to the relationship between that and praxis, which Karuna, you were raising. I think that was one of the motivating core forces behind this book, to really understand, like, how do we go, what is that tension? And in fact, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer had this idea of a constant contradiction of theory and praxis, which in part I ended up embracing, even though, but to put it in a different direction, in a sense, right? I mean, it was as if I believed theoretically in this constant clash, but put it to use in a different way, so as not then to retreat from the domain of praxis in a way that I saw, at least in the 60s, or maybe right after the war as well, in the eclipse of reason. But so where does that leave us? Yeah, I think you're entirely right that the notion of portability is crucial, but it can't be portability as in just, I mean, it's in the complexity of translation, right? And so, I mean, you were putting your fingers precisely on the problem, but it's not as if we can abandon the notion of trying to understand how something might work in a different context. I mean, and then that's how I understand the notion of portability, that there are these models and ways of doing things that we then may try, or we confront the situation in this way with that model. It's dangerous when we think we're going to just kind of like put the model in and do the same strategy. But it is all in the struggle to understand this bidirectionality. So again, so that's a whole, we'll have to continue this conversation, which is the whole meat of the relationship between theory and praxis. Now, Meg, showing one's hand, yeah. So it's funny. So you really put your finger right on the fact that, you know, this originally, the draft was 3 parts. It was theory, utopia, praxis, and the book ultimately has this 4th part, and the 4th part is about me showing my hand, right? It's the part of it where inevitably, if I was in, I felt as if I could end it by simply saying, okay, we have to ask ourselves that question: what more am I to do? And I could have ended it there, but I really felt this obligation to answer. It felt like a cop-out to not address that, and The result, of course, is a particular showing of hand, a particular reflexivity to this work, or to the need of this work, which is one that is urging us all to, it's urging me to engage in this form. I appreciate that it then becomes an intervention in a style of implicating oneself, right? You were suggesting theory equals praxis equals style. I think that's right. There becomes a way in which one has to, at least, or I had to implicate myself ultimately in my own years of praxis, and see how that had changed over time. And it was actually in seeing that and seeing those changes and different ways in which I myself approached questions of the death penalty or Guantanamo, etc., that I could see actually kind of theory and praxis in confrontation, in contradiction, moving each other in different ways. Okay, so I don't think I could do justice in 5 minutes, but thank you immensely, and I would like to think that this is just the beginning of a conversation. I hope it was, okay, Lydia.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very much, and all panelists. Indeed, this is the beginning of a longer conversation, and so much has come, is put on the table. And I have one question already here in the Q&A. What I wanted to remind the audience, if you wanted to raise a question, please type in Q&A, and I read them out to Bernard and the panelists. The first one, I don't know if this is addressed to Bernard or other panelists. I'll just read it out now. You will see it as I read it. Do you see critical theory in the tradition of the Frankfurt school as more praxis-oriented than French structuralism, meaning Deleuze, Foucault, and why? I thought this is probably addressed to Bernard and also Martin. Second, do you think the internet makes critical theory and philosophy more accessible and digestible through discussion forums and so on? Does this aid praxis in any way? So there are two separate questions raised by the same person. Please keep your answers short so then we can go to the next one.
Okay, well, I'll just quickly start, and then maybe other people can jump in. Okay, you know, it's on the first question, it's very different forms of praxis emerged from the Frankfurt School and from post-structuralist thought. And so I don't think that it would be fair to kind of quantify because the praxis that came out of these thoughts were themselves very different. And of course they were, at least the early Frankfurt School, the historical situation within which they found themselves were also determinative in a particular way. So that, for instance, the post-structuralist thought of Foucault in the 1970s is situated at a time of French government repression of Maoist movements, and therefore, for instance, the beginning of the 70s, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons is action oriented, and as I try to suggest in the piece, kind of tries to theorize how discourse analysis can actually change our praxis. So it was fully praxis oriented, and of course the early Frankfurt School was also fully praxis oriented. So I don't think that you can kind of say that one was more than the other, but that they were kind of embedded in their own theoretical foundations or structures that had particular implications in the way in which those would play out. And then very quickly on the second one, I do think that the internet makes critical theory more accessible, in the sense that I believe that, and this pandemic crisis is going to do this. We are much more involved in conversation, or at least there's the opportunity of conversation, which helps with the accessibility a lot of these ideas, as long as we're being accessible while we talk. But I want to invite others to address these questions as well.
Yes, please.
I would underline what Bernard said. I would just put it a little bit differently, but it's, I think, basically the same idea. The history of political thinking in the 20th century is also a debate about what practice and political practice and engagement means and is. And I think early Frankfurt School and, let's say, early 20th century Marxism and mid and late 20th century post-structuralism in a way differ fundamentally on the very object of political practice and the very form. And therefore, it's not that the one is more practice-oriented than the other. They interpret what it means to engage completely differently. And this also has to do with what Gayatri Spivak was highlighting, the incredibly important and incredibly intractable question of the relationship between the individual and the collective. And this is something that changes completely, because early 1930s optimism about the party form and the revolutionary form of emancipatory politics is completely different from, let's say, semi-disillusioned 1970s thinking. And again, I would like to come back to my, I think, a little bit maybe harshly sounding word, voluntarism or subjectivism. Bernard makes the very, very strong suggestion that the main addressee of the question what is to be done today is the individual. So it's a whole politics of the soul or of the self or of the subject that is proposed here. And that, to me, is the real provocation of this book, because it defies all, let's say, generalized accounts or solutions or answers you could give to the question, what is to be done? Bernard says, it's up to you.
Thank you. Karuna and me, do you have anything to add? All right. No? Okay. We have another question. It says, what do you think of the core search model advocated and practiced by the Italian operaismo movement, or the notion of counter-research? Oh, okay. Let's see. I see Meek is going to answer this question. Hello?
Meek, you want to take this one on?
No, somehow there's a line that pops up that says Miki is going to answer. In any case, so it's a very specific question about the Italian operaismo movement. I don't know who this is addressed to, probably Bernard?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me, we in the Praxis 1313, we dealt in part with the operaismo movement and the other movements, and some of the movements from the 1970s as well, particularly when we had Claire Fontaine on our panel, and my sense from that discussion really was that we needed to think about the way in which those forms of praxis engaged other kind of aesthetic practices, and so I mean it was a it was a useful conversation to push us to examine particular interventions, like, well, we were looking particularly at the Attraverso manifesto and Dada Maoism also, and Clairefontaine's work in particular, which were in part, at least for Clairefontaine, artistic interventions intended to disrupt situations and to kind of to have us rethink and rethink the present and relations of power. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it fits clearly in the category of rethinking praxis, and which is where the work is trying to push us.
Thank you, Bernard. We have time for one more question. I have this question that just came in. I'll read it out. In the genealogy of important strands of critical theory, the focus was on the one side of the early Frankfurt school and on the other side on Deleuze and Foucault. It curiously left out deconstructive theories as presented by Derrida. The latter has been blamed for scattering, weakening, and eventually inhibiting left-wing activism. But deconstruction was also an important source for post-colonial theory. If we think of Spivak, for instance, isn't there an important push toward acknowledging the world's complexity and the great necessity to consider the position of the self to be rediscovered through deconstructive theory? So that's the whole question. And this is the final question we can take as time is limited. So this is for Bernard, I think, or anyone. We'll start with Bernard.
Okay, so yeah, you know, I would say that deconstructive practice is part of critique. And so I would say that Derrida's work is kind of fundamental to the work of unmasking, really, since the deconstructive work, as I understand it, in Derrida, is trying to show the way in which particular relations of domination, of well understood kind of common sense relations between you know, what is written and what is not written, or that those are illusions in a sense, right? And it's a practice of masking that takes place. I think that it was very, I mean, I think it was if you had to take that Foucault quote that I started with about what do you do after critique? Well, you know, it's not for us to propose. The deconstructive practices were most wedded to that, to stopping there, right? Even more so in a way, I feel, than Foucault, who jumps into the breach in all of the political situations that he confronted ultimately. But I agree that the deconstructive move is essential to, or you know, important to forms of defetishizing. And in that sense, it's right, as our participant asked, whether it is necessary to consider the position of the self to be rediscovered through deconstructive theory. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yes. That those moves will ultimately push us, I would argue, to the self. But maybe Mick or Karuna want to add something on this? Yeah,
Please.
Martin.
For me, the main suggestion of, let's say, late Derrida, after the so-called ethical turn, which is not a good term for this, was something pretty much alike of what you propose. Because Derrida would have said to the question, what do you do after critique? He would have said, you cannot not propose something else. Mm-hmm. He would have said that the moment of critique might never be over, but also the moment of taking a stance is nothing to be suspended indefinitely. And in that, he might even be on a different planet than Foucault was, who in a way, at the time at least, was trying to suspend judgment or position taking, at least on a theoretical level, whereas Derrida was pretty clear in the need to position oneself. And it could be that this is one of the legacies of, let's say, deconstructive responsibility that might come pretty close to what you in your more moral sensibility are trying to teach us, at least in the last part of the book. But this is a little bit, it can only be constructed on a detour because you don't engage with, let's say, real deconstructive philosophy or theory or these texts. But there is a similar, yeah.
Right. Well, I agree with you that definitely. I agree with you that definitely there would be that Derrida would make that move on that Foucault statement, right? That the idea that you wait a minute, you're critiquing now and then now you're proposing later, that those he would clearly deconstruct that, and I think that Gayatri Spivak would draw much more and does draw much more on Derrida than, I mean, searing critique of Foucault in her work, right? So it has to be the case that would be a way forward. I didn't always see it in Derrida, but clearly one sees it in Gayatri Spivak's work and in her very existence and all of her praxis, which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the amount of time that she dedicates to praxis in India is really inspiring. But did someone else want to jump in?
Feel free. No?
Mick, you want to turn on your mic?
Mick, you're muted.
You got to turn on, unmute.
No, I've got nothing really substantial to add, except I agree with Bernard's position, if I understand it right, what he just said. I would see deconstruction as an extremely powerful form of critique. It's a way of lacerating all fixed positions. And I'm particularly enamored with I guess it's the earlier Derrida work on Bataille, on Artaud, and Genet, etc., as wild thinkers who think, as we say today, outside the box, who were unpopular. And I see, in addition, I would think the curliness, the tricks that Derrida plays with his style is exactly what I would have in mind as a type of writing which decomposes the world and which we set together to try and understand our own steps and ways of thinking.
Karuna should have the last word, though.
Sorry, I don't have a specific comment on deconstruction, but I do think the conversation has been really, I think, a very interesting question about pushing Bernard, I think, to think about what the turn to the self might mean as a way to mediate a relationship to communal solidarity. Because I think that would be my only pushback or question that I think, Martin, I'm very excited to hear your comments. And I think I agree with quite a bit about the early Frankfurt in social science, but I wonder if what Bernard is pushing towards is another way of thinking about the relationship of individual action to the community. I mean, as he said, in some ways, you can't think of collective action without a mediation through the individual. I think that position might end up being quite different from either late Foucault on Turn to the Self, which is a part of it, and the Derridian. I mean, you could still involve those questions, but there is a kind of attempt to rethink one's connection to a collective practice, which I think neither of those, a purely subjective or a purely existentialist account, gets back to. And I think that is that would be a really exciting and interesting way to rethink the problem of the collective again. So I don't think it's either, again, it's trying to refuse the either or of a pure voluntarism and a pure objective community in action.
Maybe I'll just say one last thing then, Lydia, if we have a second.
Please do.
No, that was very helpful, Karuna, because the move to what more am I to do, so the move to that is not intended to be a practice of the self in the strict kind of late Foucauldian sense, but rather, if one were able to do it, to bring that work in terms of practices of the self back into conversation with the work on power knowledge that preceded it, or temporally that where the focus was on savoir pouvoir and power knowledge, and if I had to map it onto some aspect of Foucault, who here I'm certainly trying to distance myself from in certain ways, it would be the project, which I think would have come had it not been for his untimely death, of trying to reintegrate the work on subjectivity, to which he in part turned. I mean, it was always there. It was there from the 1970s, etc. But to reintegrate that into the knowledge, the knowledge power matrix, so that we would be thinking more specifically about our own involvement and our own individual praxis within a kind of fully integrated space of demasked illusions and assessment of value. So it's in a way, it would take us beyond the practices of the self to the kind of integration which I think was intended, or that Foucault had in mind ultimately, which would have been to bring back the history of sexuality to the questions of governmentality, which, I mean, I argue he does, and he shows the way in the 4th volume of the history of sexuality. But yeah, that was helpful in part because of to put that in relationship. It is not intended to be a move to practices of the self, but to an individual kind of questioning of that can reactivate in a way the question, what is to be done, but in a different way, to reactivate the action imperative. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard. Belatedly, we got a question, but I don't think we'll have the time for you to go another round of responses. But I wanted to read the question to you. This is to Professor Harcourt. What does the signify unmask means to you? Is it possible to live without masks in a Lacanian or theatrical sense? I'll just leave it with you. I think it's a very interesting question, since Professor Martin Saar brought up a very important point about Freud. This is totally related to how we think about this difficult question of practice. What would this praxis look like on a non-voluntary basis? I think this exchange is going extremely interesting directions, directing us to some fundamental problems of politics. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I wanted to, before we close, I wanted to alert everybody the audience to chat. If you take a look at the link there, you will find a link to Columbia University Press, where you can get a hold of a copy of Bernard Harcourt's book and use the code that we give you. You get 20% off. I wanted to thank everybody, the audience, for staying for 1 hour and a half. And I wanted to thank the panelists for an extremely stimulating conversation we're having, which will be the beginning of many conversations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. And thank you, Martin, Karuna, and Mick. Thank you so much. And everyone for listening.